Dame Nature, the goddess, one very bright day, in strolling through Nunham, met Brown in her way. And bless me, she said with an insolent sneer, I wonder that fellow will dare to come here. What more than I did has your impudence planned? The lawn, wood, and water are all of my hand. In my very best manner, with themes for scales, I lifted the hills and I scooped out the vales. With silvers in umbrage, I graced every brow and poured the rich Thames through the meadows below. Grant it, he cried, to your sovereign command. I bow as I ought, gentle lady, your hand. The weather's inviting, so let us move on. You know what you did, and now see what I've done. The soft undulations, both distant and near, that heave from the lawns and yet scarcely appear. Who bade the slopes fall with that delicate sleight? Who cast them in shade, and who placed them in light? The ridges are melted, the boundaries gone. Observe all these changes and candidly own, I have clothed you when naked, and when underdressed, I have stripped you again to your bodice and vest. Concealed every blemish and beauty displayed, as Reynolds would picture some exquisite maid. Each spirited feature would happily place, and shed o'er the whole inexpressible grace. And I hope will perceive how each object is caught, and is soft in exactly the point where it ought. That ground of your moulding is certainly fine, but the swell of that knoll and those openings are mine. A wood of my planting, the goddess cried, hold! 'Tis grown very hot, and 'tis grown very cold. She fanned and she shuddered, she coughed and she sneezed, inclined to be angry, inclined to be pleased. Half smiled and half pouted, then turned from the views, and dropped him a curtsy, and blushing withdrew. Yet soon recollecting her thoughts as she passed, I may have my revenge on this fellow at last. For a lucky conjecture comes into my head, that whate'er he has done and whate'er he has said, the world's little malice will balk his design. Each fault they'll call his, and each excellence mine.
Welcome back to the Country House podcast, and thank you, Geoff, for that wonderful reading, which was called The Late Improvements, I believe, by William Whitehead, the 18th century poet laureate. And it relates to our subject today, which is going to be Capability Brown. I think I'm very glad we're doing this episode today because, I mean, I'm currently sort of taking refuge. Listeners who are watching us on YouTube will see that both Geoff and I have taken refuge in different places to where we normally sit because it's so hot. We're sort of trying to cool down. I mean, England, for people who aren't in England, is so hot at the moment. I mean, it's sort of England's green and slightly yellowing land. And there's sort of bright sunshine, and all the festival goers are kind of parched, and it's very much kind of it feels like August, doesn't it, Geoff? Not
it does,
June.
yeah. I know, it's lovely. I mean, when we say it's hot for us. I'm sure our Texan listeners know what real heat is like. For us,
they'd laugh.
In the late 20s, we're all sort of dying.
It's pretty. Yeah, it's like 29 degrees, and I can barely speak. But that's the Scottish blood.
But it's a good time to be talking about Capability Brown because everyone's outside enjoying the beautiful countryside and enjoying the landscapes. So
exactly. Well, it's sort of that we all flock in these times of heat to England's beautiful parks, and a lot of them, as we all know, look natural, but they're not. And this was basically, in many ways, pioneered by Capability Brown. So he's the subject of our podcast today. And Geoff, that was a very well read, and I think you have a wonderful. I can see you as a children's bedtime story reader. Actually, that was just. I want you to read me Roald Dahl. That was just lovely.
It was easy rhyme schemes, yeah.
But what's the gist of that poem? What's it saying about Brown? Do you think?
I mean, really, it's interesting because when it was written, Brown was quite contentious. People criticized the way he was creating landscapes that looked natural. He had quite a few enemies who preferred formal planting. And I think what it is there is it's I mean, the gist of the poem really is Brown meets the goddess of nature and is boasting to her about how he's improved nature through what he's done. Mm-hmm. And, the quotes about how she might have planted the woods, but he's created the openings that create the vistas and stuff like that. And I suppose it's a slightly tongue-in-cheek thing about, how grand he thought he was. He did think he was quite important, but he also was a bit of a genius. And I think the poem sort of encapsulates both his pomposity and his, I suppose, ingenious visions for these parks.
I think
But
there's no doubt he was a genius, and we'll get on to that. But
mm,
talking about his pomposity, I mean, he obviously had a lot to be pompous about, but I think people were very aware that he wasn't actually that grand in and of himself, was he? So
yeah.
can you tell me a bit about his early background and where he came from?
Mm. Yeah, so it's interesting. He was an early sort of disruptor coming from a modest farming family. I say disruptor because he challenged I suppose the historic status quo that was formal gardens. He was seen as a vandal, as a sort of a commoner who came in to destroy these historic parterres and landscapes.
Mm.
So there was a lot of snobbery around him, even though he had these great patrons. So his name is actually Lancelot Brown. Capability was his nickname, and Lancelot Brown was born in 1716 in a little village called Kirkharle in Northumberland,
Mhm.
which is in the north of England on the Scottish border. And he was the fifth of six children to a modest sort of working class or lower middle class yeomanry farming family. His father was a land agent, which meant he did work for grand landowners. So Brown would have had early access
Access.
to historic landscapes, I suppose. And it gave him some exposure growing up with his father doing that to sort of estate management, rural farming techniques, and that sort of stuff, which would tie in with his landscape. Because I suppose when
Yeah.
you think about a Capability Brown landscape, it's simultaneously a beautiful landscape and working agricultural land, and that's where he married the two so well. When you think about the ha-has that lead onto grazing
Mm.
fields, parklands, which for deer parks or whatever. So there's that overlap with parks between a created garden and a working estate.
Mm.
And he was brought up, surrounded by the most beautiful rolling hills and natural scenery. Northumberland is a beautiful county from the sense of its natural, the grandeur of its hills and mountains and valleys and rivers and lakes.
Quite romantic, and I'm sure we
Yeah.
can get on to that later and talking about how the picturesque sort of begins to lean later into the romantic movement as it picks up pace in the late 18th century. But okay, so he comes from this yeomanry family.
Yeah.
He's rural. He understands how farms work, how land works, all this sort of thing. He's a younger child. He's precocious. I don't know about you, Geoff. I'm an older sibling, and I'm very annoyed that I'm not a younger sibling because as an older sibling, I'm basically a complete neurotic and do as my parents do me. Whereas younger children are so relaxed and they break the rules and they're not allowed to break the rules. It really. What are you?
I'm middle. So my little sister is more relaxed than me, and my big sister is probably more rule abiding than me.
Yeah. So you're sort of interesting. Are you quite competitive?
On some things, yeah.
On some things, okay.
On things the things that I care about, yeah. I mean, sport, I'm the least competitive person you ever meet in your life. I mean, I get so bored, I just sort of peel off halfway through a match. But other things I'm very competitive about, yeah.
So we've got this young farmer. How does he go from this, I mean, rural profession in a remote part of England to becoming a landscape designer? I mean, that's quite an unusual career turn, Geoff. Can you talk to me about this? I mean, what's his education?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It links in, I suppose, with the Joseph Paxton episode we did a few months ago or last month on the idea of patronage by these grand country house owners, collectors, patrons of the arts and so forth. So this was the case for Capability Brown as well. Went to a local school where he learnt a lot of practical skills. But at 16, he became an apprentice to Sir William Lorraine, who lived at Kirkharle Hall, the big house in the village where Brown lived. And it was whilst he was sort of an apprentice to Sir William Lorraine that he learnt the intricacies of estate management, gardening, landscaping. Again, totally informal training, but very practical. And importantly, it was rooted very much in learning about trees specifically, but horticulture in general. It's about planting, strategic planting, sort of practical skills, and also the landscaping element of clearing rivers, damming lakes, that sort of thing, which are all very practical things that he later applied to his work.
Okay.
I suppose, and that really set the foundations in terms of, like any great creator, craftsman, whatever you want to call it, the fact that he was apprenticed in the key skills, practical skills at a young age, meant that he was then able to, I suppose, probably, I imagine, be a good manager when he was doing these vast landscapes in his late 20s and 30s. He knew the details of what, so often it's the same with master, people who own big building companies or architects. If you've learned how to point bricks and learnt how to, retile a roof, it sets you apart in terms of managing a team that's doing that.
Of course. And I think one of the things that's interesting about Brown is that, and we'll talk about this later on, but the style that people often call his style was not new. I mean, people like Kent and Bridgman had been exploring this gradual loosening of the landscape. But I think what was new was that he was able to scale it up onto much bigger areas of land that were previously 18th century landscape gardens, have been quite intimate. The sort of the Kent garden at Stowe, and we'll get onto that, was quite small. Yeah. The Elysian Fields, whereas Brown's stuff is amazing, and the mastery of technique must have been extraordinary. But so he's done the basics. He's had this sort of apprenticeship. How does he get involved with Stowe? How does he get involved with William Kent? Because as far as I understand it, this is the moment that his career starts to take off.
And this was a sort of second apprenticeship for him, working under Kent. So in 1739, so he would have been, I suppose, 23, he moved right down south from Northumberland to Buckinghamshire, where he was taken on as an apprentice, basically a second apprentice to, or an assistant to William Kent, who, as you mentioned, was sort of pioneered the Romantic English landscape. And William Kent himself was working for Lord Cobham, who lived at Stowe House in Buckinghamshire. As you mentioned, we're one of the great estates of England, really, both the house and the landscape. And I mean, Stowe is interesting as a whole, because you saw in one estate an opportunity for a lot of budding architects as well as landscape designers to sort of train up under the great masters. You look at the lineage, architectural lineage of Stowe, and so many great architects were trained on that house in the same way that Brown was trained under Kent on the landscape there. I mean, what are some examples of some of the architects who worked on Stowe, Rory? You probably know it better than me, but I think
Vanbrugh. We got Van.
I was going to say one of your favorites. And was he quite young in that point? Was he learning from others when he worked on Stowe?
No, he was at the end of his career, but he was beginning to get more experimental with gardens, and so was I think probably learning from other people there. I think Bridgman was there too.
Yeah, he was.
So I think he was talking a lot to Bridgman. But I mean, Stowe is incredible, and for our listeners who haven't come across it or been to it, this is kind of one of the greatest gardens in Europe. I mean, and period. It's just incredible. It's it is the estate, especially in terms of landscape design, that's the who's who of garden designers. Pretty much anyone who was anyone for 200 years worked there, and it was so beautiful that Catherine the Great, the great Tsarina of Russia, was sort of obsessed with it and decided to model half of St. Petersburg on it. I mean, it's just like really, really important.
And it was interesting that when Brown moved to Stowe to work under William Kent and in turn under Lord Cobham, he started out again a bit like Paxton at Chatsworth. He started out as a sort of junior gardener. And again, he continued learning. So he had learnt about the sort of nitty gritty of estate management at the sort of rugged estate in Northumberland. Then at Stowe, he learnt about intricate plant schemes, color schemes, and all that sort of stuff. And specifically from Kent, he learnt about this sort of naturalistic, romantic landscape style that Kent had pioneered. Which drove him, I think, and there's probably an element where he drew on his inspiration from Northumberland in terms of these sweeping landscapes, these sweeping vistas.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So So it's really I'm so interested in the subject. Listeners will know it's one of my favourite subjects. I mean, Lord Cobham, who owned Stowe, he was obsessed with landscape design, and there are lots of different answers to this. But one of them is that the family surname was Temple, and so all the temples at Stowe were a bit of a kind of joke pun on the family name. But obviously, he employs Kent, and Kent designs the Elysian Fields, which is this really famous, quite small, intimate section in the center of the garden with some really, really famous follies in it. Temple of the British Worthies, for example. And it's just exquisite. But how do we, I've got a couple of questions. What did
you've just got to point out that his favorite the family motto, Templar quam dilecta, which means how beautiful are the temples, was the family motto. So again, that wonderful double.
It's a bit like Francis Tresham at Rushton Triangular Lodge. But what did Brown learn from Kent, and where did Brown's design sort of theory differ from Kent's, I suppose?
Yeah, that's a good question. So he learned from Kent, I think, the idea of creating a naturalistic landscape. So he had experienced these beautiful natural landscapes in Northumberland, but actually learning how to create it. Kent had an extraordinary eye, and I think the hardest thing for Brown and Kent and later Repton and others was having a clear vision for what something will look like in 100, 200, 300 years' time, because we have to remember that none of the landscapes we see today Brown got to see, or Kent got to see. When you're planting oak saplings that take 300 years to reach full height, to picture that, I think, was something that he learnt from Kent quite keenly. I think what else he learned? So just on a side note, one of the other important things that he secured, I suppose, working at Stowe, was contacts with very powerful, wealthy clients. So it was sort of Stowe sort of showcased the natural landscape, and Brown and all these grand people come and stay there. So it's interesting. He became head gardener at Stowe in 1741. So bear in mind, he moved there in 1736. So 5 years later, he became head gardener. He also worked with James Gibbs and Kent, I think, died in 1748. So he had a good sort of 12 years learning from Kent. And he departed Stowe quite soon after he left, after Kent died. But in terms of some of the other things he learned from Kent, but then I suppose instituted or created on a bigger scale, were things like the idea of sweeping away all these formal parterres and gardens that had been fashionable since the Tudor period through Elizabethan, and creating them with the idea of creating a garden that merged or melted into the landscape. So you would start with these smooth rolling lawns that extended right up to the house. So you'd go out of the house into a smooth, perfectly mowed, striped lawn, which would then end in a ha-ha perhaps, and then rolling parkland beyond. But of course, the nature of the ha-ha hiding the separation, it looked like it was one long landscape, which was something he learned. And then also the other thing is, I mentioned trees. And how he could picture how trees would look in 100, 200, 300 years' time. That trees play a huge part in Brown's practice, namely the idea of natural-looking clumps of trees, sort of little, rather than a whole forest or wood, but rather than a single tree, having a clump of 3, 4, 5 trees to create essentially to sort of frame different views or vistas. And then I suppose the third thing, which is a sort of hallmark of Brown's landscapes, is the idea of artificial lakes and serpentine rivers. A serpentine river being a sort of I suppose it's a lake cum river, really. I suppose for our listeners who aren't sure, it looks like imagine damming a stream sufficiently that it looks like a much wider river than it is. So it's not a full blown lake. He just essentially made the river's much wider, so it looks like you've got this enormous river going through your valley when actually it's just a stream.
And then it normally snakes, the serpentine element, as it will snake around the body of land to make it look like it's much bigger than it is.
Yeah, because you glimpse it through the clumps of trees or through the hills. Exactly.
You can't see the end of it. And there's, a famous example is at Hyde Park, the Serpentine Lake, which looks huge. But anyway, it's an optical effect. But it's so interesting.
The other thing Brown abhorred was symmetry and sort of even numbers. So you would always find he worked out that it's more pleasing to the eye subconsciously to have odd numbers, unless they're framing something. But even if they're framing something, let's have odd numbers. So he'd always plant trees in sets of 3 or 5 or 7, and likewise getting rid of straight avenues and geometric parterres and replacing them with. And I mean, what I think is so extraordinary with Brown is that when you picture a Brownian landscape, you picture something that seems so naturally beautiful. And there are places where that landscape is natural. But in the case of Brown, it's a carefully composed and created. Even hills were sometimes created by Brown to frame views or hide parts of views.
It's really, really amazing what was happening to the English landscape at the time. This wasn't an entirely new trend. I mean, people had started to loosen up the landscapes. You've got these amazing poems like, Ben Jonson's Penthurst in the sort of 1650s or something, which is all about people beginning to get excited about wildernesses at the end of gardens. And that's the very, very, very start of it. And then in the late 17th century, people like Bamber and Bridgman are beginning to get interested about this wilderness concept. And so you've got the very formal parterres near the house, and the further away you get from the house, the more loose it became. And they started to have wiggly paths and wiggly lakes and things like this. And then Kent sort of brings it closer to the house, and then as you say, Brown brings it right up to the house. And the idea is that they're landscapes trying to imitate paintings, classical scenes. And I suppose also, but it's, as far as I understand, there's also a very heavy kind of political economic element to it as well, because there's a sense that England is a democracy, and it doesn't want to sort of it doesn't want these very rigid gardens anymore, because they kind of represent absolute authority, and this loosening of the landscape represents the loosening of English politics. And there's also this sense that your garden representing a perfect model farm is also a sort of metaphor for the state, so this rural England. There are lots of, it's not kind of clear cut. There isn't any one thesis surrounding it, is there? But there are lots of different allusions going on that make these gardens very fascinating metaphors for England at the time.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We've talked in the past about how the Baroque was quite short-lived in Britain, because when the Whigs came, when it became fashionable for the Whigs to have more pared back, restrained, less European, less flamboyant or ostentatious or flashy architecture. That coincided, I think, that sort of slightly predated the idea of the landscapes also not being flashy. Ironically, people in the know would know how expensive these landscapes were to create and maintain. But it was seen, I suppose the modern comparison is, you might say, shabby chic or something like that. The idea of having something that looks natural, but it actually costs a lot to look natural.
They're so bucolic. They're really, really bucolic. I recently found myself in this absolutely stunning Capability Brown landscape around Knowsley Hall near Liverpool, and it was it was dusk, Geoff, and I was going for a jog through this park, and it was absolutely exquisite. The way Brown almost thought about the way the shadows would fall away from the trees, and so as you were moving through this park, you had these pools of golden light falling around trees and hills and things, and it really felt as, you subconsciously feel like it's kind of curated. It's just perfect. It's like a perfect landscape. And you wouldn't know that it's been man-made, but it has been. But everything's been thought about. The angles, the light, the vistas. It creates an extraordinarily peaceful atmosphere, I have to say, when you're experiencing them. What's your,
I suppose I mean, what's interesting, I'll sort of jump in there, Rory. It's interesting in late in his career, Brown met Hannah More, who was one of the blue stockings. She was a sort of counter-revolutionary. She was referred to as a sort of conservative feminist, philanthropist, all sorts of things. And she, in her writings, she wrote about Brown using grammatical imagery. So the
Yeah.
idea is she wrote, now there he said he, pointing his finger, I make a comma, and there, pointing to another spot where a more decided turn is proper, I make a colon. At another part where an interruption is desirable to break the view, a parenthesis, now full stop, and then I begin on another subject. And it's the idea that a bit like a writer crafting one's sentences and one's words. So Brown crafted these landscapes to make it flow.
Absolutely, and that's fascinating. That's so fascinating, and that I think is partly the inheritance from William Kent, because William Kent was very close with the poet Alexander Pope, and Pope wrote all these pastoral poems, where he was imagining an Elysian landscape, because he didn't travel very much.
He was very critical of formal gardens, actually, Pope.
Yeah, really critical, which is weird because he was a Tory, but that's a whole other story. But he was very critical of these formal gardens, and he was great mates with William Kent. And Pope's sort of use of punctuation and stuff in his poems is kind of radical. And Kent and him were Kent was using the images in Pope's poems and translating them into real gardens. And I think that Brown kind of picks up on that and sort of perfects it. But I think let's sort of move on. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting about Brown, as opposed to Kent, as we've said, is this use of scale and this ability to look at a huge sweep of landscape and transform it, and that sort of vision earned him the nickname that we know him for, didn't it?
Yes, it did. So he was nicknamed Capability Brown because of his own phrase, which was that he would see he would visit a potential client and would say that their property had capability for improvement.
Yeah.
It's a classic sales pitch. There's room for improvement, and so it was because of that he was nicknamed by his clients Capability Brown. And so he would always, he would describe essentially. He would visit a site, usually a slightly overgrown or well-kept formal garden, and would say this has potential, it has great capability for improvement. And then he would describe how he would transform the landscape into something more, I suppose, harmonious, more naturalistic, more beautiful. And it was one of those funny things where it was sort of part, some people use it as an insult, some people used it as praise. He embraced it. It became a sort of professional sort of moniker for him, and he embraced it, a bit like Mrs. Thatcher, who was called the Iron Lady in a slighting sense, and she embraced it as her sort of title. So Brown did the same. But the idea was also it tapped into his sort of the way he liked to portray himself as being optimistic, and the idea that you can transform anything into something beautiful if you put in the right time. And it is extraordinary how quickly his work snowballed. So I think overall, over the course of his practice, he designed over 170 parks.
Really? That many?
And that's just English country house parks. He also designed, for example, he designed a number of urban projects, including the college gardens on the Backs at Cambridge. He laid out the plan for how the Backs worked with the bridges and all that.
Really?
A sort of master plan for the Backs. Yeah,
I didn't know that. That is absolutely fascinating. Because when you punt, for our listeners, if you haven't punted down the Backs, that's one of life's great joys. Even if you fall in, the water's lovely and refreshing, and it's all great. And when you punt through those down the river, under those bridges, looking at the trees, it does feel perfect. I always thought it was just a very happy coincidence that all the gardeners of all the colleges had managed to sort of club together and create something that works.
It's interesting, but you also see how it combines the idea of it being simultaneously, beautiful, pastoral, and yet there's the formality of the college buildings and the
yeah.
and the way you combine the two. And yeah,
I mean, there's that corner when you're going around from John's through to Trinity Gardens, and you've got the Wren Library coming up on the left, and those bridges in the scene. I mean, people will recognize it from a million different films, but it honestly, I mean, it's just one of the most eye-wateringly beautiful. I mean, to get a bit existential now, Geoff, what do you think is it about this? I mean, critics can call it plain. I think critics of Brown called his landscapes deserts of green because they were so plain. But what is it about this sort of judicious planting of trees, water, bridges, hills, essentially, that is so pleasing? Because it is amazing.
I think if I'm well, I mean, I'll get all theological and Puritan, but I think it's I think it's the idea. I think it's the idea of I mean, if you go back to sort of the biblical concept of the fall of man, the fall of the world, the sin breaking into the world and brokenness coming into the world, the idea is the world was created perfect, and then it was sort of ruined by man. And the idea, I think, is it's sort of what he's creating is he's creating the naturalistic look that almost is like how perhaps the world looked pre-fall, but also tapping into the best of human design and man-made beauty, which we know that we've said this a million times on the podcast, that a beautiful view isn't ruined by buildings, it's ruined by ugly buildings. And creating an exquisite natural looking landscape, sort of perfect pre-fall of man perfection, with dots of follies or bridges or orangeries or whatever it is that sort of dotted around the landscape that are the best of human aesthetic endeavors, I guess. That's what I sort of think. But
I agree. I feel that, and this is kind of what I was saying about Knowsley earlier, but I can also point out other ones. I mean, I find when you're walking through these landscapes, I mean, I feel very calm, and I find I can think very clearly. And I find that there are obvious places to walk. There are avenues, and there are sort of, points on the horizon to look on and reflect at. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know about you, Geoff, but I love walking and thinking. I'm a great walker. And I find that these spaces are just so conducive and physically calm. It has a physical effect on me.
It does, yeah. It's you feel the burdens of the world fall off your shoulders when you're in places like that. Absolutely.
It doesn't have to be a golden summer's day. It could be a wintry day. It could even be raining. It could be.
I love Brown's landscapes in the autumn because he would always plant his clumps of trees, which we'll talk a little bit more about because some people were very rude about them. But he always planted a mix of different indigenous trees. He might have planted a few sort of soaring cedars to sort of frame a view or something, but generally speaking, you would have it was clumps of indigenous trees which were all different. So you might have a hornbeam, a beech, and an oak, and the beauty with those trees is they all go different colors at different times. And so in the autumn, I think it's so lovely walking through a Brownian landscape. Go somewhere like Stowe in the autumn and you've got so many different shades.
It's a symphony of color. I mean, it's just amazing. So many different colors. Really, really, really beautiful. And also, they change throughout the seasons, these gardens. I mean, that's what's so strange about them. They are works of art, but they're also living things. And so the tone changes throughout the year. And in the spring, they're so full of hope. And you've got little lambs gambling around and all this kind of thing. And then in the autumn, you've got the leaves dying and the sense of this color and these long, hot days, but also very reflective, meditative. I love how you have that variation, I suppose. But I suppose... Talk to me a bit more about the trees, because I didn't really appreciate anything about the clumps of trees. Why were what was the story there?
Yeah, so again, he created these to make them look to frame views and vistas and break up vistas so that it wasn't just a long, just a far-reaching view. But the idea is that the way I think it's the way your eyes are trained or the way your eyes work. You struggle. It's about having different things at different distances make you see different things in different ways. And so the idea is that you might have a clump that's close that you can focus on, and then you focus on the one further away and the one further away, and it sort of merges them together. Exactly, telescoping. But what I love is there was his greatest critic was a guy, sort of gentry baronet, who was very involved in what was known as the picturesque debate of the 1790s. He despised the picturesque.
They had great debates, didn't they? Honestly, I'd love us to be having a picturesque debate now. That's fantastic.
I know, it's great, isn't it? And what I love is this. He referred to Brown's clumps of trees as so many puddings turned out of one common mould. And then, interestingly, there was a chap called Russell Page, who was a gardener at Longleat, who accused Brown of encouraging his wealthy clients to tear out their splendid formal gardens and replace them with his compositions of grass, tree clumps, and shapeless pools and lakes. And so, but then what was funny was there was a chap called Richard Owen Cambridge, who was an English poet and a sort of satirical author, who hoped that he would die before Brown. He used to say he would die before Brown so that he could see heaven before it was improved, which I love.
That's really funny. But I suppose it must have been quite traumatizing for these gardeners. I mean, a lot of them spent their whole lives keeping up these places, and then they were torn apart, and they would never live to see their maturity. It must have been quite. I mean, it must have not been until the kind of the mid-Victorian period, until some of these trees were 100 years old, and then they actually look half decent.
It's true.
I mean, did Brown? I mean, he must have. It depends how rich his clients were, I suppose, but he must have been planting mature trees as well. They importing mature trees and trying to plant them where he could.
I imagine he would have done. I'm not sure. I haven't read that he did not, but I suspect he would have planted some mature trees, just as today, if you're creating a park or a landscape, you might import some mature and some saplings. But what is interesting is just how many projects he was able to take on, the capacity to create so many. I mean, we'll talk a little bit. I want to touch on Blenheim in a minute, because he famously improved Vanbragh's design for the bridge by half submerging it.
You're on shaky territory there, Geoff. Be careful. Nothing could ever improve on Vanbrugh, everyone.
But yeah, so just some of the houses that he worked on, I said over 170.
Can you give us some names?
Because he worked famously at Belvoir Castle. And there's actually a fun documentary, if you watch it, that came out a few years ago, where the current Duchess of Rutland, who's been a guest on this podcast, sought to implement some of Brown's unimplemented designs. So she got out the old maps and found there were certain vistas that hadn't been opened up that Brown had planned to do. And so that's quite a fun way of seeing a sort of Brownian landscape completed in the 21st century.
That's so really Belvoir,
cool.
But that was really cool. Just to interject there, didn't the Duke of Rutland fell some of the brown trees in order to help rebuild the roof of Notre Dame?
He offered to. He organised the clubbing together of English country houses to offer to provide all the oak for Notre Dame, and the French turned him down, sadly.
Oh no! Oh dear!
I know. Yeah.
It's very bad form from the French government.
I know. They've forgotten how much they owe us in terms of the 1940s rescuing them.
Well, I suppose it must have been very difficult, mustn't it? All those parks were originally supplying trees that beat them, under in Trafalgar and things like this. So I suppose they're probably licking their wounds from this. Anyway, never mind.
But, exactly. No, you're right. And so, but he did. Yeah, I mean, it's a lovely idea of actually linking in with our broader sort of mentality at the Country House podcast. The idea of that sense of stewardship and continuity that a lot of what I find it really interesting. I remember a country house owner saying to me once that, when his ancestors were planting these trees in the 17 or 1800s, they thought those trees would be going towards building ships to fight the French. Yeah. But then, of course, the wars with the French stopped or changed, and we don't build ships out of oak anymore. And it's interesting when you look at those trees and parks that were probably planned by the landowners for very different purposes to what they are now.
Well, I suppose it comes in swings and roundabouts. I mean, because in a way, I mean, you're probably going to get cross at me for saying this, Geoff, but what they were doing at the time was a kind of rewilding. And it's what a lot of estate agents are doing now again. Yeah. they were returning, as they saw it, although it was agricultural, they were turning back their parks into sort of wildernesses as they saw them, full of wildflowers and all these sorts of things.
Exactly. I suppose the interesting thing is creating naturalistic landscapes in places that that probably had never been particularly naturalistic. So it might be that the soil wasn't such, or in places like Norfolk, for example, some of the houses there which had brown parks, where Norfolk's so flat, it would have just been
draining a lot of land.
It would have just been it would have just been a flat view for miles and miles, and instead Brown inserts these sort of gentle hills and stuff, and creates naturalistic landscapes. So yeah, some of the other examples of houses he worked on were so he worked at Blenheim, and we mentioned that he dammed the stream flowing under the Vanbrugh designed this extraordinary bridge. Did he not, Rory? Tell us about the bridge.
He did. So Vanbrugh designed a huge bridge, which was meant to be part of the approach to Blenheim, but in the end, it took so long to build because the Duchess was a bit tricky about it that they ended up designing a new entrance. So it just became a folly in the park. And
it was over quite a little stream, wasn't it?
Well, it was originally not meant to be over anything at all. It was meant to be a sort of giant, kind of Roman aqueduct kind of style situation over a bit of a bog, I suppose. And then the Duchess introduced a stream, a canal, a formal canal type situation. Then Brown thought, I can improve on this, and flooded the whole valley from, I suppose, the canal. And created a huge lake, which looks quite naturalistic, actually. And
whilst submerging half the bridge, it actually makes the bridge melt into the landscape much better, I think. But
I think you're wrong.
The architecture's lost, which is a shame. But maybe
I don't mind about losing half the bridge, but I do. I'm going to be very controversial for saying this because the bridge is a very much cherished national monument, and the lake. But I do feel that. I wonder actually that when you're in France or something and you see those aqueducts, those old Roman aqueducts spanning great valleys, and it's very dry but kind of very monumental and impressive. I feel that the bridge at Blenheim would have been like that. But anyway, we can agree to disagree on it. But what are the other? It is very beautiful. Regardless, it's an incredibly beautiful site. What are some of the other famous Brown landscapes?
So I mentioned Belvoir, Blenheim, Warwick Castle, which again, it showed that he was so fashionable that he was engaged by people with all sorts of different architectural styles of their houses. It wasn't just the great Georgian piles or Baroque piles or whatever it was. So Warwick Castle, he worked at Harwood in Yorkshire, Chatsworth, of course, the seat of the Dukes of Devonshire, Highclere, where they filmed Downton Abbey, which was pre-Charles Barry Italianizing or I suppose Jacobetanizing the house. Milton Abbey famously was a great landscape that he created because it was very controversial what he did at Milton Abbey, because it's an exquisite landscape. It's now a school, Milton Abbey. But for Joseph Damer, who was the first Earl of Dorchester, they famously decided that he didn't want the village ruining his view, and so they basically created an estate village out of view of the Brown Parkland, and flooded the village and covered it in a lake. So it's interesting. So those are just some examples, but so many. I mean,
it's funny. You know that someone or something has been a very successful concept when their name, their brand, as it were, becomes the name for something. So, for example, we call Hoovers because that's what we because they're so famous. But they were originally invented by Mr. Hoover. That's one probably not terribly good example.
No, it's true. It's true because people might have a Dyson, but they still call it the Hoover. Yeah,
they still call it the Hoover, and people call the kind of landscape design that we're talking about now, and there are plenty of other people who did these landscapes that weren't Brown, but people call them Capability Brown landscapes because he is the person who is most famously associated with them. But I suppose, so we've got this guy, super successful, having a marvelous time designing all these landscapes. Did he get a royal appointment? What happened to him? Did he become as grand as his patrons? He must have made a lot of money.
So he did make a lot of money. So by the 1760s, he was earning an average of £6,000 a year, which is the equivalent of about £1.3 million a year in today's money.
That was more than Mr. Bingley in Pride and Prejudice, which is about 30, 40 years later. So Mrs. Bennet would have got very excited. So he was okay. So he was pretty rich.
He did very well for himself from yeomanry farmers farming stock, and he did buy his own estate in Cambridgeshire, actually. So a village called Fen Stanton in what was then Huntingdonshire. He bought a modest, nice estate from the Earl of Northampton. And actually, interestingly, Brown was appointed High Sheriff of Cambridgeshire and Huntingdonshire in 1770. Yeah, so he did get sort of, I suppose, kudos or credibility from the establishment in that sense. He's actually buried in Fen Stanton. So there's a modest grave in the graveyard where he's buried, and then there's a beautiful memorial in the church.
Oh, nice. Was he happily married? Did he have children? I mean, what was the private life of Brown like?
Yeah, so he did. Yeah, I think he had 8 children. So he married. 8? Yeah, he had 8 children. He married a lady called Bridget Wyatt in 1744 and had 8 children. And actually, his son Lance, great name, ended up doing his duties at as High Sheriff because Brown was too busy with commissions earning lots of money.
Was this Wyatt, as in the famous James Wyatt, who also became an architect?
No, this is. I think it's pronounced Wyatt. It's spelled Wayet.
Okay. Yeah.
But then, interestingly, we saw, how the next generation then became even grander. So Brown's last commission was for his son-in-law's house, which is called Barrington Hall in Herefordshire, which is a proper Palladian pile. And that was his last big project. So yeah,
I want to talking about the later life.
I just need to jump in one sec. He also designed, occasionally he worked on architecture. So he actually designed a substantial house, which was Croom Court in Worcestershire.
Yeah, the Coventry.
Yeah, the Coventry. And Brown designed the actual architecture of this very, very pretty Palladian house.
Yes. And it was him who suggested that Wyatt built Broadway, whatever it is, Folly
Tower,
on top of Broadway Tower on top of the Rid. How interesting. But I mean, let's talk now a little bit about how the landscape taste is still changing. Taste is forever moving, molten. We've got the next generation of people like Repton beginning to come up with their own sort of theories about landscape design. So does he become outmoded? I mean, how does taste move on? How does he adapt? How are things changing at the end of his life?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is we see through his life and then after his death a transition to more and more naturalistic landscapes. So we think about his early work at Stowe, which was an almost ornamental naturalistic landscape. And likewise at somewhere like Claremont Gardens, a beautiful romantic classical garden in Surrey, which also was worked on by Kent. And I think Vanbrugh worked on Claremont House, did he not?
He did, yes. But it's interesting you should use these terms. That there's a difference, isn't there, between romantic classicism and romantic Gothic, isn't there?
A little bit more about the difference between the sort of romantic classicism, romantic Gothic, and also between sort of the romantic English landscape garden as opposed to a sort of a Brownian parkland setting.
Sure. So you've got this strange, I suppose, tastes and fashions bleed into each other, and normally you don't have a kind of defining cutoff point in the same way that sort of Vanbrugh and Bridgman's landscapes bleed into Kent, which bleeds into Brown. Quite literally at Stowe, where they're all kind of working together. But what seems to happen is you have this emphasis in the sort of mid 18th century, I suppose, early to mid 18th century on replicating classical landscapes, so landscapes that people would be seeing on their grand tours around Rome, studded with classical follies. And then over time, especially as the Gothic's becoming more fashionable and Gothic follies are being built in anticipation of whole Gothic houses, there's this slight tweak. So you go from what a romanticized classical landscape to increasingly romanticized Gothic landscapes, which are meant to be slightly more dramatic, slightly more brooding, perhaps slightly more intimidating. They're meant to sort of arouse passions rather than arouse sort of curious and contemplative thought. It's quite a subtle distinction, but that becomes more and more in vogue towards the end of the 18th century. And I suppose Repton, I think, sort of perhaps takes on the baton and starts to develop some of these more impassioned landscapes.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so exactly right. And because Brown came before Repton and was at that turning point from more formal gardens, we still had those classical elements and those slightly formal elements of things like canals, perfectly circular fish ponds, for example. Those sorts of elements, and of course the follies. Whereas Repton built more on the broader landscape idea and created even more sort of naturalistic and unspoiled landscapes, like at Wentworth Woodhouse, which had fewer of those ornamental aspects. I think in many ways, I think Brown, from a combining the house and the gardens, I think Brown nailed it in terms of enough formality within his landscapes that it tied in the house with the garden, but enough naturalistic planting that it all sat harmoniously together.
It's really interesting. I mean, everyone has their kind of favorite in terms of the ratio between formal and lack of formality. I'm probably a bit earlier. I probably prefer, I love Brown, but I'm probably even more fond of Kent. I prefer the slightly more intimate landscapes like Rousham.
Rousham, yeah.
And other people find, that the Repton's more that kind of thing. I mean, it's quite. These are the great issues, listeners, that English people talk about, or the right kind of English people talk about. Who's their favorite 18th century landscape designer? But okay, so this new star's beginning to come in. I mean, ultimately, I suppose what happened to Brown, Geoff? Did he die old? Did he die young? I mean, was he sort of what happened? What was the end of the story for him?
Yeah, so he died in 1783 at the age of 66,
just before the French Revolution.
Yeah, and he died in London. So it's interesting. So he lived a lot of the time at Fenstanton in Huntingdonshire, as I said. So he bought it in 1768 for £13,000, which is the equivalent of about £2.5 million today. And that came with a much more substantial landholding than that money would buy today. So it came with about 2,500 acres, 2 manor houses and 2 villages.
A couple of villages thrown in for good measure.
And he worked on his own garden landscape there. Didn't create an extraordinary landscape of his own, but it was lovely. And that property stayed in his family passed down by descent until the 1780s when it was sold off in lots. But it was actually because of owning
1780s.
Sorry, the 1880s. Sorry, my bad. 1817 is the 1880s. It was when it was sold off in lots. But interestingly, it was only because of the ownership of that property that he was then asked to stand as High Sheriff and serve as High Sheriff. And yeah, his death was rather sudden. So he died. You'll love the story. He died on the doorstep of his daughter Bridget Holland's house, which was number 6 Hertford Street in Mayfair in London.
Oh, really? That's so funny. We're once tearing up the town and going to the disreputable 5 Hertford Street. We're all being haunted by the ghost of Capability Brown.
He died on the doorstep of the house next door. Exactly. And the best was this: he suddenly collapsed and died on the doorstep of Bridget Holland's house, 6 Hertford Street, as he was returning from a big night out with Lord Coventry.
Oh, that is so funny. Well, I'm sure other people have collapsed on the doorstep of 5 Hertford Street before. So how interesting.
But then what was even more brilliant was Horace Walpole's response. So Horace
We can
Walpole.
always rely on Horace Walpole to say something horrid.
So he wrote to Anne Fitzpatrick, who was the Countess of Ossory. She was at one point the Duchess of Grafton. He wrote to her, Horace Walpole did. He said, "Your dryads must go into black gloves, madam. Their father-in-law, Lady Nature's second husband, is dead," which is quite fun.
Okay, that was quite nice. Nice.
Interestingly, we talked about the upward mobility of his family. So his son, as I mentioned, built Barrington Hall. His daughter, Bridget Holland, married the architect Henry Holland, who did a lot of work in London, as we've talked about, and they married at St George's, Hanover Square, which was the great society church. So there was a lot of upward mobility amongst the Brown family as a result, I suppose, of Brown's success financially and socially.
And I suppose as a parting shot, Geoff, what do you think? What would you say the legacy of both Brown and the sort of his contribution to the English landscape movement is?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think to be honest with you, so he's known as the father of the English landscape garden, but I think his work, he's probably had more of an impact on the appearance of the English countryside than any other single person. I think when you think about, I suppose, I don't know, whoever it was who started doing the enclosures of land probably had a huge impact as well. But that was
William the Conqueror harrowing the north or something like that.
No, I think with Brown, in terms of transforming the landscape, when you think about these 170 houses plus, and then the legacy of Repton and others and the many hundreds of houses they worked on, and we think about the size of these estates as they were, most of England was privately owned by landowners, and most of those landowners had Brownian landscapes.
But they were just the parks around the houses, not the full estate.
Yeah, I know, but I think what it did is it became so recognizable, because although it was the parks around the estates, most people in the countryside lived on these estates, or near these estates. And so it became, I think for us as well, because so many of these houses have been immortalized in television and in books. I think when you picture the English countryside, and especially when you picture an English country house, you picture it within a Brownian landscape. And I think it's become synonymous with Englishness and the English countryside. I think but I think also his legacy is bigger than that, because he didn't just create something so iconic that it is perpetually associated with the English countryside. He also shaped, this is perhaps going too deep and philosophical, but I think he helped by shaping the way we engaged with nature and embraced nature and improved nature. He, I think, impacted a little on Britain's national consciousness, perhaps even national identity, in terms of how Britain as a whole, the people, the country, approach. I suppose when you think about the difference between, this might be overthinking it, but you think about in Europe, where they kept up their very ostentatious architecture and their formal gardens. And then we saw this growing disconnect between the wealthy and the working classes that ended up in revolution sweeping across Europe. There are lots of reasons why we never had a full-blown revolution. Well, we killed the king in the English Civil War, but when revolution was sweeping through Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, and it never got a grip really in Britain. There are lots of reasons for that. Amongst them, I think, our reforms in Parliament of poor laws and, giving more people the vote and all that sort of stuff. But I think part of it was the fact that there was not the same resentment from the working classes to the upper classes in Britain as there was in Europe. And I think I think perhaps Brown could be slightly accredited with that, in terms of doing away with this ridiculous, flashy gardens and houses, and embracing a more rural, naturalistic, modest, humble style of planting. I mean, what do you...
I don't know. I mean, I think it's to do with, I see what you're saying. I'm not necessarily sure I entirely agree, but I think that there's definitely a sense of on an economic level, the English landscape garden is coinciding with the agricultural revolution, whereby England does see itself as a sort of, nation of good husbandry, and I suppose husbandry has sort of social metaphors as well, looking after your flock, all that jazz. And what I was talking about earlier about the sense that there's these sort of absolute European monarchies insist on these very formal landscapes, which represent not just control, but domination of nature, whereas the English loosening their gardens and loosening their landscapes is a metaphor for the kind of loosening of the constitution and democracy and all that jazz. I do think there's something in that. I mean, I don't necessarily know whether people felt sort of placated, whether a very poor person felt placated because their landowner was creating a nice park. But I do agree that these landscapes became emblematic of a different kind of society and culture, which I think probably did sort of stop subsequent revolutions.
And it's interesting. Well, it's interesting because linked to that, I think it's also because of Brown that we have so many 18th and 19th century landscapes today, because formal gardens were so intensive and costly in terms of maintenance that I think when we look at the decline of the English country house in the late 19th and 20th centuries, and we think of how many houses were demolished, often the landscapes remain, but even those houses that did stay in private hands, I think if they had acres and acres of formal gardens, which would have got totally overgrown. And we know that things like topiary, once it's overgrown, you can't take it back. You can't take cut back an enormous yew tree to make it into a beautiful yew ball again. Whereas the beauty of Brown's landscapes were that they could get a bit overgrown, they could lack maintenance and still be beautiful and still be restored in a way that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, it's really interesting, listeners, when you visit a bit of the countryside and you find yourself wandering through a patch of, I suppose, grassland, and you find it really particularly beautiful. Sometimes it's because that you are actually walking through an old park and the house has been destroyed, but there is this sense of curation around it. That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about the fact that they survive because they're actually quite easy to maintain. I'm sure that's right. That must be right.
And also they are costly in terms of, we know that trees self-seed and then you end up but it's easy to then cut down a tree. But I think the idea is that you can, whilst we know that the National Trust spends fortune restoring Capability Brown parklands and stuff, but actually the beauty is with these landscapes is they can look a bit shabby and still look beautiful, because what is shabby? It's just long grass. Well, Brown's parks all had long grass in them, so it was just that.
A lot of landowners cultivate them now more than they would have been. So a lot of landowners will keep a few green fields near the house, but they'll be planting and sowing. They'll be doing arable farming on some of the further away fields, but keeping the planting of the trees and the foliage and stuff. So they're quite versatile, and quite sort of. How interesting. I hadn't thought of that. That's great. Well, look, Geoff, I have to say, this has been a really fascinating episode. I've really enjoyed it. It's been a lovely one. So I'm looking out of a window onto a very sunny London, lots of trees sort of having a nice time. So thank you.
It's lovely for me. I'm looking out onto a romantic landscape in Devon, which includes Brownian planting. There's a park here where my cottage is, on the estate my cottage is, and which is not by Brown, but again, you would call it a Brownian park.
Hoover planting.
The way, exactly, Hoover planting. Yeah, I like that. So, and again, what I can see is just across beyond the wall, there's sheep grazing in the park. So it's exactly that. It's that combination of functionality and beauty, and I think he did very well. So thank you, Rory, for some challenging questions. And some good questions. And
I got carried away. Well, look, for our listeners, please, we hope you enjoy this. Please drop us a like or a review. We love reviews. Catch this on YouTube. It will be going up. And do you have anything to add, Geoff?
No, that's good. We're hoping, lovely listeners, we know we've fallen severely behind on questions and answers. As you will know, Rory and I juggle day jobs, which can be quite demanding, but we're hoping to put more time into this. And especially we're hoping to resurrect our Q&A episodes. So do start sending in questions again. We'd love to start having a bit of a bank of questions to address. And on that note, thank you again for joining us. Please join us again next week and have a lovely week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.